Okay, right. Thanks, Diego, and good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, just a quick overview of alarm management. I'm trying to make it fairly generic. My background is the process industry, so the oil, gas, chemical, major hazards. So I'll share you something about how we handle alarms. I'm aware that alarms occur in a lot of different industries and arrangements are different, technology is different. Some of the solutions won't necessarily work directly, but I do believe that alarm management as a whole is there's a lot of generic transferable things there that you can learn from looking at these things. So I'm trying to make it as generic as I can. So just quickly, why do we need alarms in some of our systems? And I think the answer is that if we have a human operator or a person involved in the system in some way, we recognize that every one of us has our limitations. So we have a certain set of we can manage a certain amount of data and processing it, but we have fairly limited abilities to do that. Find it quite difficult to pay attention for a long time, so our attention drifts off somewhere else, and sometimes our vigilance isn't as good as it could be. So we might think has happened, but we wouldn't necessarily recognize what it is, how important it is, why we need to respond. So that all those situations set us up to be not particularly good at monitoring systems. So an alarm seems to be a good solution. It's a way of attracting our attention to something that needs our attention, and stimulating us to do something. Well, an alarm's occurred, I obviously have to do something about that alarm. So to a large part, alarms are set up, are useful because of our human limitations. Now, so they sound like a great solution, and they can be, but as I say, my background, where I do most of my work as a consultant, is in oil, gas, chemical type industries. These are complex, and but they are very hazardous. We have the ability, and we have unfortunately managed to have big accidents that have killed many people, tens of people, even thousands. If you look at Bhopal from a chemical release, unfortunately many people died as a result of that. We have some quite sophisticated technology, and this is where those human limitations start to apply. There's a lot of data. Our technology creates a lot of data, and it's basically too much for one person, right, or even a team of people to handle. So we need to think about how we present that information, and so alarms are a big part of that. But we've got lots of examples where we've got that wrong, and where an alarm that's been set up in theory to help the person who's operating it has actually made it worse. And one of the more recent examples is this refinery fire in the US, the BP Husky, only in 2022. 2 fatalities, unfortunately, as a result of this fire and explosion, and they have to be brothers Ben and Max Morrissey. They were working on the site together. And what we found in the investigation was that the process had been upset. There'd been an event that meant it wasn't operating as it should do, that caused a whole load of problems. But when we looked at what had been going on in the intervening hours, there'd been 3,700 alarms in that 12 hours. So you're looking at that's over 300 alarms per hour. So this thing that we've set up, these alarms that we've set up to help the operator, I think we don't have to be human factors experts to realize that dealing with 300 alarms in an hour is just not manageable. So actually, instead of something we've put in place to prevent this sort of accident, has probably contributed to it in some way. And unfortunately, that's not this isn't the first example of where we've had problems, and ironically, a lot of those problems stem from we've created alarms because we've recognized human limitations, but we've then designed them, implemented them, managed them in a way that actually makes those limitations an even bigger issue. So actually alarms, especially if they're unnecessary or if they're a nuisance alarms, they become a distraction. The alarm keeps going off. Something that should have been helping the operator actually distracts them from something that may be more important that they were dealing with already. If we don't manage the rate that they occur, the person becomes overloaded. We call this an alarm flood, so that the number of alarms occurring in an hour or possibly, in we tend to look at a 10-minute period. If you're getting more than, say, 10 alarms in 10 minutes, it's almost certain that the operator can't deal with them, or certainly not deal with them effectively. And if it carries on for any longer, they're just fully overloaded. And often it causes confusion as well. Some of that is just the way the alarms are described. We find it's maybe an engineer who decides how to explain the alarms, but they use different terminology, different language to the operator. So the operator sees an alarm and says, I don't really know what that means. So that sort of confusion. Or sometimes they get an alarm and it doesn't seem to match what they're seeing elsewhere or other sources of information that they're using. And so, the alarms, again, which should have been focusing attention on, actually become a cause of confusion. So it's a clear sign that we haven't set these systems up properly. So why does that happen? What are the root causes? I think part of the problem is that we often look at alarms in isolation. So if you take each alarm individually, they make sense, and you can almost say that's really important. So we might have a high temperature on a piece of equipment, and we know that if the temperature goes too high, that piece of equipment might fail. So in isolation, that seems like, well, yes, it's really important. We really must have an alarm for that. But then we're seeing systems with thousands of alarms configured. And so that one alarm, if we look at every alarm individually, we might be able to justify it. But when you look at how the alarm system as a whole functions, and it's not unheard of to have 10,000 alarms that one operator might have to understand. And you start to see that as a whole, it's not functioning. And and a lot of the time, and I'm an engineer by background, and it is clear that engineers tend to be very focused on the equipment, and they just say, well, as I said, that temperature, if the temperature goes high, our equipment might fail, so it's really important we have an alarm. So that alarm doesn't solve anything, and so what they don't appreciate is the human fact, the human user. They don't look at, well, what is realistically, could the operator do anything about it? What else will be happening at that time? Would they be doing something more important at the time? So they look at the technique, the hardware, the nuts and bolts of it, and they don't realise what problem they're creating for the operator. And so I say we are in the industries that I work in. We've recognised this, and it's not a new, it's not new to us. So we're talking over 30 years since one particular accident in the south of Wales in the UK, a Milford Haven refinery fire. In fact, we were very lucky that day. No one actually was killed. Some injuries, but it did do a lot of damage, including to the Milford Haven town centre. The shop windows were blown in as a result of the explosion. So we can't see it as a success that no one died. It was just a matter of luck. But when you looked at it, again, it was one of these alarm floods. Something started to go wrong, and alarms were coming in so quickly they couldn't even be displayed. They were, as soon as they appeared, another one would come along and they'd be disappearing off the screen. Well, when we looked at it, there was one particular alarm that if the operators had seen that, they may have realised what was going on. But that was one alarm out of hundreds, and so it wasn't realistic. I'm sure some people probably did start to say, well, why didn't the operator deal with that alarm? Well, the answer is they had hundreds of other alarms to deal with as well. So yeah, it's not it's not something new to us. Unfortunately, we're still having these problems. But just to show there is some history there. If anyone starts to say, in your industries, if you're working in a different industry, people might be surprised that alarm management is even a topic of discussion. When I say we've got 30 years of discussing it so far. So as a result of that accident, the HSE, so our regulator in the UK, they commissioned some research, which was published 4 years later. And actually a year after that, the first edition of EMEA 191 was released. So this is a guidance document that I think it was probably the first guide that came out about alarm management. It's not the only one now, and subsequently, so things like we've got now an international standard, so that's 62682, which was released in 2022. And as a result of that, partly, EMEA has been updated as well. And as Diego said, I was the lead author for that. So if you're not working in, and it's, although the guidance and the standard is, again, fairly generic in some ways, I have to say that it's most focused on process industries. But I'm in some discussions already with other industries, so like the water industry in the UK, can see that there's a lot in the guidance that applies to them, but the way they don't have the same technology, the same ability to manage as we do. So, like I say, what I'm trying to do today is bring some of the generic messages across. And I would say the guidance out there, EMEA 191, does have it there, but you might find that some of the details you can't follow. So yeah, the water industry is one. Marine ships is another one where I'm talking to people at the moment where they've got some different issues. I know the medical industry is talking about alarms, and clearly that's a long way from an oil refinery, but I would think that a lot of the generic messages would still apply. So one of those key messages is that alarms need to be managed, and I think, like all things, if we've got a bunch of people involved in this, so you've got, for alarms, you're going to have, okay, the operator who receives it, you've got the designer, someone's got to maintain the equipment that creates those alarms. They need to understand. You need to have managers and leaders need to understand how alarms do and can work. Otherwise, you don't have a functioning management system. So that's why you need to, and I would say you have to have something written down about this. In that, the way you manage that, you have to identify who the user is. So I'm pretty clear, if we have a control room at an oil refinery, it's the control room operator who's going to receive the alarm, and it's their job to deal with it. And what we find is other people have an interest. So there might be a maintenance team who would like some information from that system, and we start to generate alarms for their benefit, but they're not the ones who are receiving it. They're not there at 2 a.m. Dealing with it. So instead of it being something, it's maybe useful to a maintenance technician when they come in to start their shift the next day, but the control room operators had to deal with that nuisance in the middle of the night. So it's actually a problem for them. So we have to be very focused on who our user is, who is our customer. We need to design for their requirements. And like all things, if we want to manage it, we've got to resource it. We've got to have people with the right competencies available to manage it as well. And then you need to think about, well, there's one thing when you're buying a new system, you need to be able to specify how alarms are handled. And even in process industry, we're still not very good at that. It's quite almost just a tick box. Can you have alarms on this system? Okay, good. We're good to go. We need to be a lot more precise about how we do that. But also existing systems as well, that we find just things change over time. Even if we install a brilliant system today, in 5 years' time, enough things will have changed that maybe alarms won't be functioning as well as they should do. So we need to keep on top of that continuously. So we need to always focus on existing as well. And one of the clear generic messages is you need to write down, you need to have a written alarm management philosophy document. And I know I still get involved in projects where they're configuring alarms and they haven't actually sat down and decide what. And so obviously you're not going to get the system you want if you haven't explained what you want in the first place. And one of the key things in that philosophy is you need to define broken down. So this is the guide from the guidance and from the standard. It's quite a long definition, and you may need to amend it for different industries, although I'd be surprised if you have to amend it very much. So first of all, it's some sort of device, so an audible and or visual means of, so that's kind of the physical side of what an alarm is, indicating to the operator. So as I say, you have to identify who your operator is or who your user is. So you might use different terminology, but it's the definition is making it clear. It's, that's what the alarm's there to do. And the definition we use is based on the equipment malfunction, a process deviation, or abnormal condition. So it's something that's wrong. And we need to be careful. We can get quite a lot of alarms that occur for something that's actually right, something that should have happened, something we're expecting to happen. And those are nuisance alarms. all the time. In our case, an operator presses a button to open a valve and they get an alarm to say the valve's opened. Well, that's not a problem. That's what they wanted to do. Alarms should be there for things that are going wrong. And I would say it's the last line really of the definition that's most important, is that event, that thing that's created, that audible or visual indication, requires a timely response. And if an operator or whoever you decide is the user of the alarm doesn't have anything to do as a result of receiving that alarm, it definitely shouldn't be an alarm. And if it doesn't need to be done relatively quickly, again, it shouldn't be an alarm. It might need to be something else, but it definitely shouldn't be an alarm. And, our rules of thumb in our industries are kind of timely would be within 2 hours, and that would be a low priority alarm. If it's within about 20 minutes, it'd probably be a high priority alarm. Other industries work differently. So the water industry, it might be, instead of 2 hours, it might be 2 days, just because of the nature of their processes. In an aircraft cockpit, we might be talking seconds, which wouldn't be realistic for our control rooms, but they say the industries are different. But I'd say the key thing is if there's no timely response from the operator, we shouldn't have an alarm there in the first place. And that's one of the fundamental things that we find is wrong with alarm management. Just to say, there are other things as well that might crop up. You might want to have different terms. So we have this term an event. So those are all the things that tend to happen. And then say the danger is we have alarms for every event that occurs. So I just said, like, opening a valve isn't an event. Most of the time, that shouldn't be an alarm. It doesn't satisfy the definition. We'll still record it as an event for other purposes, but we shouldn't have an alarm. We might have something like an operator prompt. So it's something that it requires a response, but it's not critical. So it's typically, we might have some sort of piece of equipment starting up and it goes through various stages, and there'll be a point where we need the operator to go and open a manual valve. So they'll get some sort of indication that they need to go and do that, because that piece of equipment isn't going to start until that valve's been opened. But if they're delayed in doing that, there's no problem with it. There's no safety concern. So that's why it's not an alarm. It does require a response, but it's not critical. It's a bit like we get so many beeps, don't we, in the house now, that your microwave will beep at you when it's finished its timer. It sounds like an alarm, but really it's just saying, well, if you want to eat that hot meal, you need to go and open the door and retrieve it. It's definitely not an alarm. It's just a useful reminder that you've got something to do. Something that can be quite close to an alarm, but typically doesn't. It might be something that the operator might choose to respond to, and these are really good for the situational awareness to say something has happened. You might want to do something about it, but actually, if you don't respond, it's not critical. It's no big deal. So a lot of alarms actually should be called. It could be configured as alerts instead. It can be a little bit confusing. They seem similar, but we should separate them because those are the things that the operator can deal with when they've got the time. And it's whereas a lot the alarms they have to deal with straight away. So by differentiating, yes, there's a timely response required. That's an alarm. Whereas, yes, the operator should know about this, but it's not critical. Okay, we call that an alert. So that's another term that I think can be translated to many different domains. It's not just a process industry thing. There's just one special case of alarm here that we refer to, a highly managed alarm. And this is to be fair, we try to avoid these as much as we can. And this is where we're relying on the operator more than perhaps we would like to. Typically, we have other devices, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that will more automated systems, or where it's not, where it's not that the operator failing to do one thing will cause a hazard, but sometimes we just can't avoid those situations. So we try to minimize the number of these things that we call highly managed alarms, because we recognize that if you're relying on an operator response, there's always some chance of some sort of human error. But we recognise that there's some cases where that is still the best solution. So by identifying them as this type of alarm, we can put more emphasis on the way they're presented to the operator, how the operator is set up to deal with them. Our preference is to handle them differently, but sometimes we can't avoid them. again, in some industries, you're probably going to have more alarms that may fall into this definition. And that's fine. It just highlights, though, that you're kind of relying on operator responses more than maybe we would choose to in an ideal world. And that brings us on to, well, just was going to talk a bit about how we in the process industry manage safety, or process safety. So process safety is the major hazard stuff, the stuff that can cause big fires, explosions, toxic releases. That's what we're kind of talking about here. And I think it's worth recognizing this because I do know that other industries don't quite have the same setup. So that, although there's lots of generic aspects for alarm management, there's some things that probably are a bit more specific. So the first thing is, we have a good design and engineering. So there is a danger that alarms come along and they're used to just mask a poorly designed system. We know that's not very good, but we stick an alarm on it, we've solved it. No, we always have to insist on good design and engineering, and I think that should be the same for every industry. We then should have some way of controlling our processes so that they stay within the safe, optimal region the whole time. We shouldn't be expecting operators to be responding to events all the time, responding to alarms. We should be able to keep the system operating where we want it. And so we call that a basic process control system. So we have a control system that's doing that largely automatically. The operator may well have be taking part, usually more to optimize rather than to keep it under full control. And so that's where the alarms come in. So if our basic process control is not working as well as it should be, that's where the operator would have to respond. So we have this advantage in this industry that we have these layers and we can see quite clearly where the alarms should fit in. And I do recognise that it's maybe not so clear in other industries. But also we have further layers. So typically, if the operator is unable to or does not respond to an alarm, there's still something else that's going to be there to save us. So some sort of safety system is there waiting to operate automatically. And we may even have another layer of protection again. So you can see a highly managed alarm is we don't have those extra layers of protection. And that's why, it's a situation we don't like to be in. And I can see that other industries may be in that more often. But I'm just trying to say that really you do need to have some layers of protection on whatever you're doing, and the better you understand how that works in practice, the better able you are to have an alarm system that works effectively. So I'm just going to show a very simple example, just how this has emerged. Really how we've got to where we have in our industry. So we would have started when we have tanks to fill with liquids. Let's assume it's a toxic or flammable liquid that we don't want to spill. So we would have had a tank with a level indication. That's the thing on the right hand side that's red and changed it to white. We would have had a valve. It's like your tap at home. You turn the tap on, the liquid goes through it, the tank level would have gone up and you close it. So we had an operator there to do that manually. Simple, fairly reliable, but as I say, people have their limitations. And no doubt we came to a situation where every now and then the operator would get distracted, forget about what they were doing. They may wander off, the tank gets overfilled. We've got a problem because we're relying on the operator. So what happened was we started to put alarms on. Okay, so we recognise the operator might make a mistake. Well, that's good. So now we've got an extra layer of protection. We put an alarm in place. That should make life safer. And actually, I'm sure most human factors people are looking there going, well, I can see maybe why it didn't do. So instead of it being a layer of protection, that then became the control system. So the operator said, well, I don't need to stand by here anymore because the alarm's going to go off and it'll tell me when I need to come back and shut the valve. So something that we thought would make our life safer, because not only are we relying on the operator, we've now got this alarm to help. In some cases, actually made it less safe because the operator wasn't doing their job anymore. They were going off doing other things. The alarm nothing's ever going to be 100% reliable. So we've actually had cases where we had more overfills instead of less. So the point there was, okay, we're recognizing that maybe one of the reasons we got two operator actions there, although there's two layers, they both rely on the operator to act. So maybe we should take a different approach. We'll get rid of that alarm and we'll just have a second valve, which will close automatically. So instead of telling the operator they need to go and close the valve, it would just close automatically. And maybe we can make that work, but it is still relying on the operator to do their bit first. And typically, whenever we make some change like that, the behaviours do change. And again, we found that what tends to happen then is the automated device, the second valve, starts to be used more frequently than it should be. It can't ever be 100% reliable. So we then get back into the situation when we're using the automated system more than we should have done. It's not reducing the risk as far as it should. And so we end up with a situation where we say, okay, we need to put the alarm back there. And the distinction there is, though, that the alarm is there. It's not really to protect the operator. It's there to stop the operator relying on the automated system. We need the discipline, though. We always need the discipline for the operator to do their bit. They're the controlling function. The alarm is there if they haven't done their bit. And if that still doesn't work, we've got the automated system. So the point here is we've got 3 layers of protection. The operator, the alarm, and the automated system, and that's how we achieve our levels of safety. And that's what I mean by when we say different layers of protection. So, kind of, this is the typical setup now in a lot of, in the process industry. Typical. That's what you would find. That combination. And again, you may well not be able to have those sorts of setups, but then you need to recognize, is that a risk that you need to manage in a different way? But what happens is we have a lot of parameters. We have on our process plants, there's lots of things that we can put alarms on. And that's the problem that we often have, is we just end up with alarms on everything because it seems like a simple solution to a problem. So we do need to quite regularly actually go through a process of what we call alarm rationalization. Is to look at every alarm, every alarm configured on a system, every alarm that an operator may well receive. And the first question is always, should we even have an alarm there? And I would say that timely response, that's usually the first question to ask. Does this require an operator's timely response? And so what we do, the first thing we always ask is, what's the operator going to do when that alarm goes off? And it's surprisingly often we'll find, well, there's not much they can do. Okay, so it shouldn't be an alarm, it should be deleted. We might well say, well, what else should it be? So I've talked about alerts, I've talked about prompts. That's part of the process. Well, we should be reviewing that on a regular basis. Also, what are the settings on it? How long will the operator have to respond? So on that tank filling example I just showed you, if it's going to go overfill within a couple of seconds, that's not enough time for the operator to respond. So we always need to make sure that the alarms are set correctly as well. And because it's not fair to the operator if we give them an alarm and they haven't actually got time to do anything about it. And finally, there's a question about prioritization as well. So we can have alarms of different priority. And I'm not going to go into too much detail. This is very case specific, but it's typically down to what's the consequence and what's the time available. So, for in this case, just 2 priorities being considered. If there's a high priority alarm, and it would require a response within less than 20 minutes, it probably will be a high priority alarm. Every other case, so either a lower consequence or there's more time available, it would be a low priority alarm. And to be fair, if it's more than 2-hour response, we probably wouldn't have an alarm at all. So that's not a timely response required anymore. I say it is very case specific how you do that prioritization, but actually, the text at the bottom there is the most important thing here. Is people start to read low priority alarm as being an alarm I can ignore, and that's definitely not the case. So the idea is we have to get this very clear to people that if we've gone through all this process and we've configured an alarm because we said there's a timely response required, every alarm should be responded to immediately. Prioritization is only provided because if 2 alarms occur at the same time, the prioritization gives the operator some idea of which alarm they should respond to first. So we've got 2 alarms. If one of them is a high priority alarm, they should be dealing with that one first and then moving on to the low priority alarm. If they've only got one alarm active at a time and it's a low priority, they should deal with that immediately. That 2 hours isn't, oh, you can leave it 2 hours before you respond. No, you should still be responding immediately. And yeah, and that's really an important thing to get over. That every alarm should always be responded to immediately. So really, just to kind of reaching the wrap up really, but it's kind of a reminder that alarms are for people, and I say people like me, engineers, have a habit of seeing them as a technical thing. Though there might be some technology sitting behind it, but it's for the person that the alarm has to be configured. They're there to mitigate, those human limitations that I recognise, and some of that is human error. That we miss things, we misunderstand things. We've got to recognise that a violation, depending on how you want to define it, but people can choose to ignore alarms, and that is part of the process. And we need to recognise that alarms often get missed just because the operator is bombarded with them, or they're just badly configured. So, whether we like the term violation or not, we do set up operators so they have to ignore alarms quite often. I would also say, though, although I've mentioned it several times about the limitations, we should also recognise that humans have amazing capabilities, that a lot of which still aren't being replicated by the technology that's available. So we're very good at perceiving things, what's going on, taking information from many different sources. So an operator, when they're receiving an alarm, it's not just the alarm that they're working from. They're looking at the alarm, they're going to find some other data sources. They're thinking about, what was I told at my shift handover? What's that maintenance team doing out there? I saw something like this 3 years ago. What do we do about it? They've taken on all that sort of information and trying to say, well, is this a similar pattern to what we've seen before? And they've taken on those data sources. But equally recognizing we're not evolving as quickly as technology. And unfortunately, as technology's improved, it's tended to make these things more difficult for the operator, which is a shame, really, because the technology does give us some great potential if we use it properly. And just to emphasize that it's a management process. The old plan, do, check, act should be what you're aiming for. So the plan is you've got to have that definition and a philosophy document. You've got to have a plan, people, commitment, resources put in place to actually do this. Putting it into practice, I'd be looking at those layers of protection. Maybe you call them something different, or they're set up differently, but you should be thinking about, where do alarms fit into the grand scheme of things, and making sure that whatever you do is there supporting the user, supporting the operator. You need to be looking for evidence to say, is it working? So KPIs, if you have incidents, do the alarms contribute in some way? And also asking the users, are these alarms helping you, or are they making your job more difficult? And recognizing that you're probably going to have to improve, and alarm rationalization is probably something that you're going to have to go through on a fairly regular basis. And it's all, and you'll learn from that. You update your philosophies, everything else. So that's what I was planning to go through. I did have a paper published in the Ergonomist, the free one we get as a member of the CIEHF, quite recently on alarms. So if anyone wants a copy of that, I can supply that, or you may well have access to it. But apart from that, I hope you found that interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions. So if I